Today we're going to talk about enclomiphene and how it helps the body produce more testosterone. But first, this is not medical advice. This should not be used to treat or diagnose medical conditions. This is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Now, for you to understand enclomiphene, you first need to understand the HPGA, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So I made this chart, and I'm going to use a little analogy to help you understand how this works. But I want you to think about the hypothalamus being a thermostat, and I want you to think about your testicles being a furnace. So the hypothalamus will detect a certain temperature and it'll basically increase the heat that the furnace is producing or basically shut it off so it's not producing as much. So the hypothalamus sits at the top. When it senses low testosterone, low estradiol, it's going to increase the production of something called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. GnRH hits the pituitary gland, where LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, are produced. LH hits the Leydig cells in the testicles, and that increases testosterone production. Testosterone is then aromatized into estradiol. On the other side of this, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, hits the Sertoli cells, and that increases spermatogenesis. So this is how it functions. If estradiol and testosterone are low, the hypothalamus senses that, and just like a thermostat senses low temperature, it dials up the heat. It turns up GnRH. If it notices that it's very high, it turns it back down. So it's trying to keep your body in fairly tight parameters. Now I understand testosterone is diurnal, but it never goes super high and it should never get super low for guys that have a normally functioning HPGA. How does a SERM work? More or less, a SERM works by tricking the body into thinking that estrogens are low. I made this chart right here. So the SERM, Selective Estrogen Receptor Modulator, like enclomiphene, will sit on the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus. So it thinks that, to use the furnace analogy, it thinks it's colder than it actually is. So it tells the furnace, spit out more heat, spit out more testosterone. So the SERM tricks the hypothalamus into thinking estrogen is low, produces more GnRH, which then hits the pituitary, increasing LH and FSH and all the downstream hormones, eventually testosterone. So a SERM more or less is tricking your body to produce more testosterone. Does it actually work? It does for the right man. And let me explain who the right man would be. So I did a long video on this, I'll link it at the end. You have two different types of hypogonadism, two different types of low testosterone. You have primary versus secondary. Think about primary hypogonadism or primary low testosterone being the furnace doesn't work. The thermostat is sensing that the temperature is low. You can crank that sucker up as much as you want, but the furnace just is not turning on. This is primary hypogonadism. The testicles are just not functioning. You may have normal or even elevated LH on blood work, but the testosterone is still relatively low. That's primary hypogonadism. So for the most part, enclomiphene is not going to work for this guy. The reason being is because you can get LH as high as you want, but if the furnace isn't working, it's just not going to produce more testosterone. Conversely, secondary hypogonadism is the furnace is working, it's just not getting the right signal. You can increase LH, and that's probably going to help increase testosterone for men with secondary hypogonadism. Now, what does the research actually say? And then we'll get into our experience at Steel Health and Hormone Center. Before we get into this study, what I want you to do me a favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody who needs to see it. But let's get into this study right here. It's titled Testosterone Restoration Using Enclomiphene Citrate in Men with Secondary Hypogonadism, a Pharmacodynamic and Pharmacokinetic Study. So remember, this is secondary hypogonadism, so the testicles function. Let's get into the methods right here. This was a randomized, single-blind, two-center, phase 2 study to evaluate the effects of 3 different doses of enclomiphene citrate, 6.25, 12.5, and 25 milligrams, this was a daily dose, versus transdermal testosterone on 24-hour LH, luteinizing hormone, and total testosterone in otherwise normal, healthy men with secondary hypogonadism. Now, I'm not going to read over all of this, but a couple things that stand out in the study. It was fairly well designed, but there's only like 40-something people that did it. Not really enough for me. And then secondly, I would have loved to see the components of the testosterone. So not just total testosterone, hopefully it's LCM SMS, we're gonna get into that. But I'd also like to see total testosterone, free testosterone, bioavailable, SHBG, albumin. I like to see the components of testosterone because sometimes that tells the whole story. But anyway, let's get into the actual results right here, then we'll get into the raw data. So the results say, after 6 weeks of continuous use, the mean concentration of total testosterone at day 42 is 604 for men taking the highest dose of enclomiphene citrate, which is 25 milligrams daily, and 500 nanograms in those men treated with transdermal testosterone. These values were higher than day one values, but not different from each other. So basically, the transdermal testosterone and the enclomiphene citrate at 25 milligrams a day were significantly higher than the beginning, but if you compared them against each other, they were comparable from a statistical significance perspective, but they weren't different enough from each other to have statistical significance. Now, digging into the raw data here, we're gonna actually look at the total testosterone in LH, because the LH is gonna kind of tell a story here and why enclomiphene may be preferred over testosterone for certain individuals. But you can see the total testosterone before they started on the 6.25, 12.5, and 25 milligram and transdermal group. It's this top line right here. Relatively low, all of them under 300, generally speaking, with some standard deviation. And then you can see there is a dose-dependent effect, roughly speaking, between the enclomiphene group, namely the more you took, the higher it got, generally speaking, and transdermal testosterone. So the transdermal testosterone went up and they all went up. What's curious though is down here where it says LH. So we can look at the LH, the mean LH, and you can see that in the enclomiphene group, it went up and up and up. But what it didn't go up in is the transdermal testosterone. So there was a dose-dependent effect on LH for enclomiphene, but the transdermal testosterone more or less really lowered LH. And that's because when you're taking exogenous testosterone, that's basically telling your body testosterone is present, estradiol is present, so it's gonna downregulate GnRH. And no matter how much it downregulates GnRH, if you're taking exogenous testosterone, it's just going to keep bringing it down and down and down. That's why so many guys will deal with basically very little endogenous, like your self-producing testosterone, and many men will see a significant drop in sperm count because LH and FSH are also impacted. So something to consider, that you may, when you're taking transdermal testosterone or exogenous testosterone in general, you'll see a drop in LH and FSH and probably a dramatically decreased sperm count. Now, one other thing I want to look at the raw data, and then we'll get into our experience, is this right here. So these are other blood chemistries that were measured during the time of this trial, but I specifically want to look at IGF-1. So this is the downfall, the basically something that isn't so great about enclomiphene. Looking at the top line right here, you can see the starting IGF-1 levels. So 101 with some variation, 94 with some variation, 96 with some variation, 103 with some variation. And you can see after 6 weeks of treatment, a significant decrease in IGF-1. Whether it was a 6.25, 12.5, or 25 milligram group, the transdermal testosterone, oddly I should say, also saw a decrease in IGF-1, but a more significant decrease in IGF-1 with the enclomiphene, and it doesn't seem to be dose dependent. Maybe it is if there was a larger study, but there is definitely a decrease in IGF-1. Now, what is the clinical significance of that? I'm not sure. We haven't really had anybody complain about a lack of sleep or anything like that, but maybe you had a different experience. If you do, let me know down below. Now let's get into our experience at Steele Health and Hormone Center. And again, none of this is medical advice. You should always work with a qualified medical professional, but enclomiphene does have a, let's say, modest increase on testosterone for men dealing with secondary low testosterone. We can see a couple hundred points bump up, 1 to 300. It's a modest increase, and most guys will notice that. They may see stronger libido, maybe a little more energy. We personally, and I'll link this video at the end too, like to do an enclomiphene HCG combination. That seems to have a more robust effect on testosterone while still maintaining LH and FSH, but that's just our experience. Enclomiphene works pretty well. HCG alone works pretty well. When you combine them both together, they seem to work very well. So look, if you're interested in seeing how Steele Health and Hormones can help you, go on our website, Steele Health and Hormones Center spelled RE.com. Fill out a contact form. We'll be in touch within 24 hours. If you learned anything in this video, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody who needs to see it, and I'll see you in the next video.